So now that we have all the setup complete, we are ready to go in and start looking at the program. So every time you start up Blender, you'll get this little splash screen. And if you've ever used Photoshop or something like that, you'll be familiar with this sort of startup file creator. Basically, all it is this left side is how you create a new file, and the right side will have any recently opened files that you may have. Creating a new file, you'll have to do so from a template. I always choose General because it will have every workspace that we need loaded into it by default. And we'll cover what workspaces are in just a moment here. So you can create a new file from some of these templates if you want to check them out. Or if you just click off of the splash window, Blender already has a new General Blender file loaded up. Now, I know the UI can be a bit overwhelming if you're not used to it. Blender is a program that has a lot of capabilities. So along with that comes sort of a busy screen. Don't freak out though. We won't be using all of this right away. This is, after all, a basics course. Now, I'm going to go over this interface a bit quickly as an overview at first, and we'll come back and revisit these tabs in more detail when it's more relevant. This will just be to familiarize yourself with some of these menus and things. To truly understand what is happening on screen here, we actually need to know a little bit of math. Don't be afraid, I'm going to keep this all very high level concept stuff. So let's break this down a little. Blender is a 3D modeling software. I kind of hope that if you're this far into the course, you already knew that. But what does that mean? So we all know that we perceive reality in the third dimension, which means that any object in the universe can have its position be described mathematically using a set of coordinates using an x, y, and z axis. In Blender, x represents where the object is in the left and right direction, y represents the forward and back direction, and z represents the up and down direction, which we can see here drawn as the red, green, and blue lines. So what is 3D as it relates to CG? The things we make in Blender, although they are 3D, they still need to be rendered or drawn onto a 2D screen in order for us to visualize it on our monitor here. So what a 3D modeling software does is it gives us the ability to create digital 3D objects that can be rendered onto a 2D screen in a way that allows us to perceive them as 3D by using the principles of perspective. And yes, I mean this perspective that we were all taught in an opening art class, which I'm not going to be covering in this because this is a Blender course, not an art fundamentals course. There are tons of great free resources online. If you do want to know more about perspective theory, just Google perspective drawing. So getting back to Blender, this main window here is called the 3D viewport, which is exactly what it sounds like. It is a 3D view of the objects in our scene. The scene is simply how we describe the container for these objects and the space around it as represented by these grid lines here. The scene is essentially the Blender file that we will create when we save this. So I may use the words scene and file here interchangeably. Every new Blender scene starts with 3 objects in it: a default cube, a camera, and a light. We're going to get more into these object types in future videos. Now, there is a pop-out panel in the 3D viewport that you can access by hitting N on the keyboard to pull up this sidebar. It can also be accessed simply by clicking this arrow here. This will show you some information on the location, rotation, and scale of the selected object. Under the item panel, the tool tab contains some options for your selection cursor. However, these options are also accessible up in the top left right here. So personally, I don't use this tab very often. The View tab has a few settings for the 3D viewport, which we're not going to change at the moment, but we're going to go over it more later when it's more applicable. This sidebar might also contain any add-ons you enable. These are a few here that I use regularly, but you do not need them for this course. Baytex is a batch FBX exporter, and Mr. Mannequins is this awesome plugin that loads in Unreal Engine's default character model, which is really just handy as a scale tool when you're building scenes for Unreal. If all of that was gibberish to you, don't worry about it. It is not stuff you need to know. You'll notice that the Text Tools add-on we downloaded and installed in the previous lesson is not here. That is just because it doesn't utilize the 3D viewport for any of its functionality, so it just lives inside another editor. Lastly, for this 3D viewport, if you hit T on the keyboard, it will toggle on and off this toolbar here. At the moment, this only contains some transform and selection tools, but you will see as we progress that this menu is context sensitive and will change. Navigating around the 3D space is critical to being able to use Blender, because in order for us to see what is on the other side of this cube, we need to be able to rotate around it. To rotate your view in Blender, simply hold the middle mouse wheel and drag your mouse around to rotate around the object. If you ever get confused about which way is up, there is also this gizmo in the upper right hand corner here that's just going to show you how your screen and how your view is currently oriented. As long as you remember that X is left and right, Y is forward and back, and Z is up and down. To pan your view around without changing the angle at which you are viewing an object, simply hold Shift and click and drag the middle mouse button in the direction you wish to move. To zoom, simply scroll the mouse wheel in and out. If you do not have a mouse wheel, you can also hold Control, hold the middle mouse button, and drag back and forth. All these operations can also be done by clicking on their icons here on the right side of the 3D viewport. The last icon here is for switching between orthographic and perspective view. This can also be done by hitting 5 on your numpad, or if you do not have a numpad, make sure Emulate Numpad is on in the preferences like we went over, and just press 5 on the keyboard. Orthographic view basically takes this view of our 3D model and flattens it out without perspective. Orthographic view is most handy when you are modeling something and you want to view it exactly from the front, side, or back. It is easy to quickly jump between orthographic views in Blender. To view the front of your model, just hit 1 on your numpad. This will snap your view into front orthographic, and you can see in the top left-hand corner where it used to say user perspective, it now says front orthographic. If you are ever unsure if you are in perspective or orthographic mode, you can always look up here. So our cube just appears as a flat square because we can only see the front side of it. If you hold the middle mouse button and rotate around, Blender will automatically switch your view back into perspective mode. However, if you pan by holding Shift, middle mouse, and dragging, or zoom with the scroll wheel, you can see that that orthographic mode is not broken. To view something from the right side, hit the number 3 on the numpad. You will have a right orthographic. To view something from the top, hit the number 7 on your numpad. Top orthographic. Now, to view the back, left, or bottom sides of this cube, try to think of it as if you were viewing the opposite of the front, right, or top, because that is how the keyboard shortcuts are laid out. So in order to view the opposite side, you just want to hit Control and then the number corresponding to that side. So if 1 will snap you into front orthographic, pressing Control and then 1 will put you into back orthographic. 3 would show you the right side orthographic and Control, and then 3 would show you the left. 7 is the top, Control 7, the bottom. If you forget these shortcuts, you can always come up to this top toolbar here in the 3D viewport where it says View. Go down to Viewpoint, and selecting any of these will snap your view to that, but it also shows you the shortcuts for doing so from your keyboard right there. It's really just nice to have that as a reference until you learn them. Additionally, the other way to navigate to these views is you can come up to this gizmo icon here and select the view by clicking on it. Clicking Y brings you to back orthographic, clicking -X brings you to left, bottom, and so on. So now that you understand the 3D viewport, we can move on to the outliner, which is this panel up here. And the outliner is basically just a list, or an outline, of all the objects that are currently in our scene. So this topmost category of the outliner is Scene Collection. It just means everything that's in this entire Blender file. We have one sub-collection here called Collection. It is created by default. This just acts as a folder. They're very handy for keeping your scenes organized, and you might have hundreds of objects in a scene if you were, for instance, creating an animated film. They work just like you would expect file folders to. You can right-click on the outliner, hit a new collection, double-click or hit F2 to rename it to something meaningful. Organize your scene how you like it, drag and drop to move things around, collapse, and expand them. I'll try as the course goes on to remind you about things like renaming objects and organizing folders to instill good habits in you, but for the basics course, I don't believe we're going to be working with any large scenes that have many objects, so you may not see me rename and organize everything. You'll notice that selecting any of these objects in the hierarchy will also highlight it here in the 3D viewport. This functions exactly the same way as if we were to select from the viewport directly. You can see it's highlighting here. Selecting from the outliner is handy in large scenes. Maybe you accidentally move your object way off into space and you couldn't find it. You can, find it in the outliner and move it back wherever you need it to be. You can also use the outliner to temporarily hide objects that might be in your way. You can do that by selecting the object and then clicking this eye icon next to it where it says Hide in Viewport. To bring it back, click it again, the eye is on. You'll see it pop in and out of the viewport here. You can also accomplish this with a keyboard shortcut. So you can do this by selecting the object in the viewport and pressing H to hide it, and pressing Alt-H to bring it back. Now, the thing about Alt-H is that, let's say you have two objects hidden, you only want to bring back the camera. So even though if we have it selected, if you press Alt-H, it will still bring back every hidden object that's in our scene. So if we had both of these hidden, and I only wanted to bring back the camera and not the light, I would have to do so in the outliner up here. This feels like a good time to talk about shortcuts. Blender is a very shortcut-heavy program. Some people love that, some hate it. I personally love it, but I do realize that it is kind of a ridiculous amount of shortcuts to learn. Blender has gotten a lot better about making its menus more easy to navigate, so if you're not a shortcut person, but I do think it is really worthwhile to learn them as it just speeds up your workflow so much when you really start modeling. So I suggest maybe just keeping some notes and write down the shortcuts we go over to have for reference until you have them memorized. The next panel underneath the outliners is the Properties panel. This panel is really important as it contains all the information for the selected object, as well as some properties of the scene in general. The icons on the left are each a different tab of the Properties panel. We have Active Tool and Workspace, Render Properties, Output Properties, View Layer Properties, Scene Properties, World Properties, and Collection Properties. All of these are more general settings that affect things regarding the entire scene, as well as how and where to render images to. We'll cover these more later on into the course. For now, we'll mostly be looking at these bottom options as they relate directly to the object that you have selected. So with the cube selected, I have these options, but when I select the light, these tabs change to reflect the different properties that this cube and this light have. So let's look at some of the cube's properties. You can just left click on it to select. Every object that you can add to the 3D viewport will have this Object Properties tab. We won't be using this one all that much, as the only really pertinent information on it for a basics course would be this Transform tab, which can be viewed more easily via the sidebar in the 3D viewport by pressing N, going to Item, and seeing the transform information right here. Next on the list is the Modifiers tab. This is probably the tab that you will be using the most of all in this course. Right now, there's nothing in it because this cube has no modifiers. We'll come back to this later, but as you can see, when you click the Add Modifiers drop-down, there is a whole list of things that you can add to this cube to modify its shape and appearance. Next on the list is the Particle Properties. We may come back to this. It is slightly more advanced feature, but we'll probably touch on it briefly towards the end of the course. Same with the Physics Properties. These are some really cool physics simulators you can use to animate a mesh in such a way that it would automatically behave like cloth or water. But again, it's a cool feature, but it's slightly more advanced than we will really be covering. We won't be covering object constraints. Object data properties we will touch on briefly probably when we talk about UV maps. Materials, this will probably be your second most used property tab. This controls how the surface of your 3D objects appear when they're rendered. So if you wanted to change the color of an object, for example, you would be controlled here through the Material tab. The last is Texture tab, and we'll be getting back to this one when we talk about texture painting. The last panel you have in the window is the Animation Timeline. This timeline shows any animations that you may have in your scene. We don't have any animations on this object, but if we did, we'd be able to see them by pressing play, and they would play here on the object itself. You also have a rewind, pause, and forward features. You're pretty much your standard playback controls. The timeline down here represents the animation in frames. Blender defaults animations to 24 frames per second, which is standard, I believe, for animated films. This setting can be changed in the Properties panel under Output Properties, Format, go down to Frame Rate, and you can click this drop down here that says 24 FPS and change it to something else. So if you were working on, say, an animation for a game, you'd probably want it to change it to at least 30. That's pretty standard for console games, but the next-gen games, PS5 era games, now run at 60. You could change it to that as well. But for now, we're just going to leave it at 24. So to convert the timeline to seconds, it's just the frame number divided by your frame rate. In our case, 24. So 120 frame 120 divided by 24 would be 5 seconds of animation. We're going to cover some basic object animation in this course, but anything like animating characters is just a bit beyond the scope of a basics course. Now, these panels in Blender are all completely configurable. You can resize any of these panels by clicking and dragging on the space between them. You can also bring in a new panel by moving the cursor over to the corner of any existing panel until you get these crosshairs. If you click, drag, pull it out, it's now split this window into two separate panels. So right now, it's just created another 3D viewport, but you can change what editor is displayed in any panel by clicking the drop-down icon at the top where it says editor type. For example, I could change this one to a shader editor, and this would give me access to Blender's visual scripting system for creating materials, just as an example. If you drag out a panel and you later need to get rid of it, place your cursor on the corner between windows, hold the left mouse button, pull it over the panel that you want to get rid of. Your cursor will turn into this arrow and that panel will go dark. When you release, that panel will be gone. So all these different panels we've just gone over are part of the layout workspace. A workspace in Blender is just a preset configuration of panels designed to speed up your workflow. So, for example, I could click to here, drag out a new panel, go to the editor type, and change this to UV editor to access this editor window. Or it is much simpler to just come up to here and click UV editing. All this does is it's removed the animation timeline and it split this panel into two, where we have the 3D viewport on one side and the UV editing workspace on the other. We'll go over what UVs are later. I don't expect you to know what that is. Just know that this panel configuration has been pre-optimized for UV editing. The same goes for all these workspaces. We will be using a few of them during this course, but any of them is configurable and renameable. And you can make a custom workspace by clicking the plus sign up here, choosing a template to go from, general, let's say modeling, adding whatever editors you want, and so on. Now, these custom workspaces are on a per file basis, meaning that if you save this file and reopen it, this custom workspace will be as you left it. But if you create a new file, this workspace will not be there. Speaking of which, if you wanted to save your Blender scene, it's pretty standard, but you're just going to come up to this top where it says File, click Save or Save As, whichever. Choose a file location where you want to save it. Name it whatever you like. And press Save As. Now, when you open that file location, it'll appear here as a .blend file. A .blend file is a special extension that can only be opened by Blender. So if you need to get a 3D model that you've made in Blender to another program, like a game engine, for example, there are ways to do that. It's just not going to be using this blend file here. But we're going to cover that more later on in the course. Okay, so in the next video, we're going to be learning how to add objects into a scene and how to move, rotate, and scale these objects.